My name is Conrad Son. I am a literary manager for Meridian Artists. And yeah, today we're going to talk about story engines. I guess the first question we want to address is what exactly is a story engine? And for the sake of this webinar, we're just going to focus on feature films and serialized scripted television. Procedurals are a little different breed of story engines, which we won't get into today. Just to reiterate, we'll talk about story engines and how they work for features and for serialized scripted television. Okay, so back to the question, what exactly is a story engine? Because this is a term that everyone throws around, but I'm actually not convinced everyone actually knows what it means. For this webinar, let's focus on how the definition works when it comes to just making you a better writer. So it might differ from what an exec or an agent might say, but what's important is that we're going to focus on how story engines are defined for the writer, okay, and how a writer uses this definition to create better screenplays. So what we typically hear when it comes to defining a story engine is that is the intangible version, right? It's what propels the story forward or what gives the story momentum or that kind of stuff. But what does that actually mean? You know, what are the nitty-gritty parts to a story engine that give a story, you know, what it needs? So basically, what is it that makes you want to keep reading or want you to keep watching a television show? And in that sense, you know, that definition isn't really wrong. I mean, to me, a story engine is kind of like gravity, right? We all understand the concept. We get that it's a force that pulls things down toward the earth, and we just kind of accept it and we kind of understand it, right? And same thing with the story engine, except instead of just accepting it as a force that pushes our story forward, I want to spend some time explaining about what actually makes up a story engine. You know, what are the elements that actually create a good engine for a story that propels your script or your story forward, and then helping us understand from there. And so for me, a story engine isn't just one thing, or one thing that makes up a story engine isn't just one element. It's certain elements in your script that work in consortium with one another, and we're going to discuss these elements. And for the sake of this webinar, I'm just going to use the metaphor of the engine, and we'll just call these pistons, okay? So just, again, this is my thing. This is not an industry term, so I wouldn't throw this around expecting other people to know what it means. But again, for the sake of this webinar, we're going to call them pistons, just because we use the metaphor of an engine. So for me, the three most important things that make up an engine, in other words, what is it that keeps the story moving forward? What is it that propels a reader to keep flipping the page and keep wanting to read more? What is it that causes the audience to want to watch the next episode or continue to watch the episode that they're on? And so the three things we're going to talk about today are stakes, our goals, and character empathy. And obviously, I'm going to go into more detail with all three of them, but those are the three that we're going to focus on. So let's start with stakes. Now, without stakes, you have no engine, right? So a man riding a camel in a desert has no engine. However, a man riding a camel in a desert who's hungry and has no water and is about to die, that story has an engine, right? And so that's what we're going to do. We want to be able to create stakes for our characters and within our world. So that's what I mean by that. And so I assume that you know, a lot of us understand the term stakes and what that means. Just to clarify, basically, it's a stake is what does the character lose if they don't achieve their goal? You know, what's at stake? And that's all great and important as it pertains to your character. You know, that's screenwriting 101. You know, characters have to have stakes that, you know, for that to mean something to them, which I'm sure you've all worked into your characters. But what writers often neglect to do is to establish stakes as it pertains into the world that they create. Because stakes only work within the context of your world, okay? And that's really important. When you create your story, when you pitch your story, or when you write your story, right away, you have to establish what your world is and what it means to the character, right? And then therefore, how the stakes work within the context of your world. What it is in the world that you've created that is vital to your character in that specific setting and world that you've created. In other words, things might not be important stakes just stand alone, right? But your job as a writer is to create a world where all those stakes matter. And that's half the battle for a story engine. So let me elaborate on a few examples. So let's look at the television show Friday Night Lights, okay? we all get what the, personal stakes of our characters, right? Street has his injury, Smash is going to college versus being a football player, Matt Saracen getting to start as a quarterback. Now, as standalone, whether or not Matt Saracen gets to start at quarterback, whether or not, Smash stays and becomes goes to college or becomes a football player, even Street having his injury, right? Those standalone, they're stakes, but they're not as important. However, in the town of Dillon, Texas, as they established right from the opening scene of that television show, the whole town's culture, the whole town's livelihood is built around that game that happens on Friday. They even call it Friday Night Lights. The whole town, the whole world that the creators created for that show is based around football and the game of football and what that game means to the people in that town. Therefore, in that world, Matt Saracen starting as a quarterback is high stakes. That world, Street's injury, meaning that he'll never get to play football again, high stakes, and whether or not Smash is going to get to go play football or whether he's going to go to college, in that world alone is high stakes. So it's important that you establish your world, create the rules of your world and how that world works, and then within the world, show the stakes within your characters. I'll use another example. Look at the show Entourage. Now, the reason why I chose to show Entourage is because everybody harps on that show because everyone talks about the stakes and how they're not real problems and they're not everyday people. And they're not wrong. Everyone's like, oh, boo-hoo, Vincent Chase didn't get the role that he wanted to. Vincent Chase might not get to play Aquaman. And they're right. As standalone, those stakes aren't that great. Those stakes aren't that important. They're not high. However, in the world of Hollywood, in the world of motion picture and film producing, that's all that matters. In the world of studio filmmaking, that's all that matters. And that's what's at stake for Vincent Chase in Entourage. However, but the reason why people like to tune in, people watch and continue to be invested in the show is because they've done such a great job in presenting that world to the audience. In that world alone, in that television show, getting a role as Aquaman is huge. Getting your film into Cannes is massive. And so that's why that show has that particular piston working for them in their engine. Because here's the thing, if your argument is about rich people aren't real problems, if that's your argument for having, a television show why certain TV shows don't work, then a lot of the television shows on TV actually, deal with a lot of rich people with rich people problems, and those shows wouldn't work, and those people wouldn't be watching them if they didn't have those stakes within those worlds. I mean, just look at Showtime. Showtime would not be successful. I mean, with the exception of Shameless, all their scripted shows are dealing with upper class people. Yet people tune in because in those specific worlds, those stakes mean everything. That's what I want to emphasize. Let's look at another show, Orange is the New Black. In that show, Piper pisses off the cook by complaining about the food. So again, not a big deal, right? But however, in the world of prisons, in the world that she's in, right, the cook controls the food, right? And you piss off the cook, you don't get the food because she got her little surprise there in her meal the next time, right? So again, in that particular world, the stakes are so high if you piss off the cook, right? So make sure you present those rules, those stakes within the world, and then your audience will be vested in the story and the characters. Let's look at another example. Better Call Saul, right? Emmy nominated for the best drama. Now, what I like about Better Call Saul is that for both the characters, Mike and Jimmy, right, the personal stakes for them, or the stakes for them, unlike Breaking Bad, the stakes for them can't be life or death. In other words, because it's an origin story of Breaking Bad, we, the audience, know for certain that neither Mike or Jimmy are going to die, right? So we have to set the stakes differently in that particular world, right? And so Peter Gould and Vince Gilligan did a great job in creating the world that's very relatable and grounded, but at the same time, we understand the stakes in that world. Mike wants to protect his daughter and granddaughter. And at the end of the day, Jimmy, as much as he's trying to make it into the legal world, he wants to court Kim Wexler. Kim Wexler is everything to him in that world. And so, that's what's important, is that we make stakes as in the context of the setting and the world that creates. So I just want to emphasize that using those specific examples. Okay, so that's stakes, right? We want to create stakes for the world. Let's talk about the next piston then. And the next piston is goals. And specifically here, we're talking about the protagonist's goal, right? And so again, so long as we give our protagonist a goal that he or she's trying to achieve, we now add another part to this engine. In other words, if we know that the character is trying to reach a goal, have some sort of objective with an obstacle in the way or anything like that, that is what creates the engine. Because once that character reaches that goal, the story's over. But the journey to that goal is what keeps us watching. Now, I know what you're thinking. This might feel very storytelling 101, right? But let me expand on a few things on how to really elevate the goals of your story. I want to talk about how you create an initial goal, but have an underlying, more important goal underneath. And I'm going to expand on this in a little bit. So what I'm trying to say is that your A plot focuses on a primary goal for your character. But that A plot, for the best stories, the stories with the best engine, that A plot actually takes a back seat at the end of the movie when you realize that there's a more meaningful goal behind it. In other words, as the protagonist tries to go for what he or she wants, she actually discovers, or she actually finds, or she actually encounters something that he or she really needs in the process. And the way to sort of test this out, or the way to sort of figure out what that means, is using the statement that I call it a litmus statement for your goals for your characters, is the phrase, but none of that matter unless. None of that matters unless. That's the statement as that I want you guys to try and use to test on your goals. And let me expand on this as I talk about a couple of examples. Okay, so I'm going to revert to a movie called Armageddon, and we've all heard of this movie. Again, everyone sort of harps on this movie because they think Michael Bay sucks, and it's a very Hollywood studio film. But I'll use it to highlight what I'm trying to say here in terms of goals, underlying goals, and the statement, but none of that matters unless. Okay, so with the movie Armageddon, right off the bat, writers confuse the goals of Armageddon and what's at stake, or a lot of people forget or confuse what is the goal at Armageddon. Because what it is right at the beginning, we established the A plot. We established the main goal. The main goal is to save the planet from being extinct from this big asteroid or meteorite, whatever it is, hitting the Earth, right? That is the A plot, right? However, when it comes to the movie, it's not the survival of the world that means anything to the audience. That's what initially draws us in. But it's not why people are crying and emotional at the end of Armageddon. They're crying because Harry Stamper needed to attend his daughter's wedding. That's why everyone's emotional. People actually didn't really care whether or not the Earth was saved or not. That's not why people got emotional. That's what's at stake, and that's what the goal is, right? And so in that world, that's all that matters. So let's use the statement to do that. So the statement is, but none of it matters unless, right? So to put that in context into our movie, right, into the movie Armageddon, I would use the statement, Harry Stamper's initial goal is to save the world from extinction, but none of that matters unless he's able to attend his daughter's wedding, right? And so that is what separates a good movie or a good story from a great story, is when a character tries to achieve one of their goals, but in essence finds out what's more important to them as they do it. What the goal, a new goal that pertains to that character specifically. And again, not only can you test it out with with the statement, the litmus statement that I was talking about, but you can also figure out, why is it people cry at a specific movie? Why is it people get emotional during specific movies? It's not because of the initial A plot. It's because of the underlying B plot, or the underlying goal that the character realizes as they're achieving that A plot. And let's look at another movie. Let's look at the movie Titanic, right? Won the Oscar for Best Picture. At the end of the day, we all know the ship sinks, right? The audience does not care if the ship sinks because, again, we know it does. We're not crying or emotional because the ship sank. We're emotional because Rose and Jack don't get to be together. That's the stakes within that world. That's the goal within that world. So the initial goal is to survive the sinking of the Titanic, but none of that matters unless Jack and Rose end up together. That's why we cry at the end of the film. That's why we feel emotional at the end of the film. Right? Same thing with the Shawshank Redemption. Right? Yes, it's great. Red and Andy got out of prison. Red got out, he got released and Andy escaped, which is the initial A plot of the movie, is Andy Dufresne trying to get out of prison. However, none of that means anything. None of that matters unless Red and Andy unite at the end, right? Had they not united at the end, that movie would not be satisfying for us. We would not be emotional at the end, but that was not the initial plot of the film. The initial plot of the film was trying to get out. And so using that litmus statement to try and figure out that underlying goal that the protagonist discovers is what gives you that extra engine for that for your story. I'll use one more example in a movie. One of my favorite movies is Jerry Maguire. Now, the initial A plot was for Ron Tidwell to succeed as Jerry's client, right? That's the story. That's the A plot. Jerry wants Rod Tidwell to succeed and become a big-time football player. And in the end, he does, right? Rod Tidwell is successful. He caught that game-winning touchdown, etc. But that's not what the audience cares about, right? That is the A plot, but he achieves the A plot, but that's not what we get emotional about, right? None of that matters, right? Unless Jerry and Dorothy do it together as a couple, right? So Rod Tidwell gets his goal. Jerry keeps his client. They're all successful. However, none of that matters unless Jerry's doing it with Dorothy, and that's what keeps us moving, what keeps us watching that movie till the very end. And so that's a very important thing to figure out within your characters as you're figuring out their goals, and then the underlying goal that feeds us to the end of the movie after our protagonist reaches a goal or doesn't reach their initial goal. So yeah, use that litmus statement in order for you to figure out what is the underlying goal that your character has. Otherwise, you just have a good movie, but it's a matter of achieving the initial goal and finding out the underlying goal that makes it a great movie. Okay, so that's feature films. Let's apply that, and let's talk a little bit about TV pilots. Now, TV pilots is a little bit different when it comes to character goals, because when it comes to the protagonist goals, the pilot has to achieve three of them: the goal of the series, the goal of the particular season, and the goal of the pilot. That's really what makes pilot writing difficult, is that those 60 pages or those 30 pages, depending if you're writing a comedy or drama, has to service all those things. We need to know, after reading that pilot, what's the goal of the series, right? What's the goal of the season or the first couple seasons, but also what's the goal within that pilot. And to complicate things, sometimes there are more than one characters that have goals within the series, right? You don't just have one character with one goal. You sometimes have three characters with three different goals. So again, that's what makes pilot writing a little bit more difficult. But at the end of the day, trying to figure out what those goals are and the underlying goals is what's going to give it that extra engine, okay? So let's look at a show like Frasier, for example. The series goal for Frasier is for him to fall in love. That's the goal that services the series arc. And so within the series goal, okay, perhaps the first season, the goal is to court women he meets at the coffee shop or something. And then perhaps in the pilot, he has to break up with his current abusive girlfriend in order to continue on. So point being, these are three goals, three stories that need to be serviced here. It all needs to be established within the pilot, and these goals essentially are the main part of your story engine. Because once the series goal has been achieved, right, once, Frasier falls in love, the show's kind of over, right? And so you have to find that goal that will feed this entire series for its whole longevity. And so find out what that is, and then find out what's more important for that character for the series, then figure out what that goal is to feed the series goal in the season, and then find out what that goal is to feed the season goal within your pilot, okay? Let's look at another TV example, Californication. So here's another example. This whole series, whether you agree, people think that it's about, Hank trying to succeed as a television writer, which is the initial A plot of the series, right? But the underlying drive, the underlying engine for that for the series, in other words, what Hank really needs is to be with his family, right? For him, we all want him and Karen to get back together and to be a good father to Becca. That's what drives the series. Despite what he's trying to do with his writing career, that takes a back seat to his whole idea of getting together with Karen Hank. That's what gives, with Karen and Becca. That's what gives that television series, The Engine, to continue on. So with that series, the season arc is the build up toward Karen's wedding, right, with her and Bill, and ultimately Hank stopping that wedding from happening. And the pilot arc in that is Hank looking for a job and getting mixed up with Bill's daughter, right? So in order to get an idea of what that whole series is, you have the series arc of building of getting them together, Hank and Karen, the season arc with building up to the wedding, and then the pilot arc with Hank getting mixed up with Bill's daughter, right? And so those three stories, those three goals, those three parts of the engine is what builds up that series, and all that has been established within, the pilot. Let's look at Breaking Bad real quickly. The Breaking Bad series arc is about Walter White making enough money for his family in light of this cancer diagnosis, and also him building the empire to make up for his lost opportunity with gray matter, right? So that's the series arc, right? The first season arc is the rise of Heisenberg, right? The business relationship that he's formed with Tuco. So that's a season arc that builds that up. And then the pilot story is for him to get Jesse to agree to cook with him and to avoid being killed by Crazy 8 in the process. So in order to establish the series, within those 60 pages, we've set up the series arc, we've set up the season arc, and we've set up the pilot arc, right, with those three things. And that's something that, if you're writing a pilot, that you have to always make sure you do. Breaking Bad, Walter, the series arc being him making money for the family and building an empire, the season arc with the rise of Heisenberg and building the relationship with him and Tuco, and the pilot arc is establishing the relationship with him and Jesse and getting Jesse to agree to cook with them and avoid being killed by Crazy 8. So those are the three things that are addressed within the pilot that make that pilot work and give it that engine. So we talked about stakes within the world. We talked about once those stakes are established, then we have the goals within within that world. Because once the stakes are established, then we know what will happen or what is at stake or what the character will lose if that goal is not achieved. Okay. So then the third piston to the story engine is character empathy, right? So we established all these things, right? We established the stakes and the goals, but the most important thing, especially with television series, but with both features and TV series, is we have to be invested in the character, right? We need to want to follow this character, and I don't like the note that people often give about the character is not likable or you're not rooting for the character, because I don't think not all characters have to be likable. Characters have to be interesting, though. Characters have to be someone that you are either curious about, but I like to use the word empathy. In other words, a character is someone that you might not like him, or you might not think he's a good person or she's a good person, but you understand where they're coming from. You get them, right? You understand what drives them, or you understand what makes them an interesting individual, right? You can look at a lot of the despicable people on TV. Walter White, he transformed into a pretty despicable person. Frank Underwood, these people are not likable characters. However, they're very interesting, and you empathize with them. And I'll go into why or how to develop this as characters in terms of building character empathy, which again is that extra piston that gives you the extra piston within your engine here. Okay, so one of the techniques that I've talked about in the past too, that make character empathy, that allows your audience to empathize with your character, is what I like to call is the truth hurts, and I'll expand that out in a second. So a lot of times, the best way to create empathy for a character is when the character is told something, or when the character has demonstrated something to them by someone else, right? And it's about them. And that something, whatever that is being told to them or demonstrated to them or conveyed to them, portrays them as a weak or substandard individual. And the reason why it hurts them, the reason why it negatively affects our character in terms of their integrity or their pride or their dignity, is because whatever's being conveyed to them, they realize is true. And that truth is what fuels them to sort of reach their goal or to become or to go through an arc. Okay. And if you can incorporate that into your character, into your story, you will have a very strong piston for the engine. So I'm going to explain that one more time. So, and then I'll expand on it. One of the best ways to create empathy for your character is create a scene or situation or a beat or moment in your story where your character is being told or demonstrated something to them, conveyed something to them that puts them or portrays them as weak or substandard. And the reason why it hurts them, or the reason why it gives them this little wound that they have and negatively affects their integrity or dignity or pride, whatever that is because they realize whatever's being conveyed to them is true, right? And it's the truth. That realization of the truth is what fuels them to reach their goal, right? And so if you can build this into your character, you will have a strong engine for your story, because we now feel for the character, right? We understand the character, and now we are on the ride with the character, and we want to continue following that character throughout your story once we understand their pain, once we understand, where that comes from. So let me explain with a few examples. I want to look to a movie called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Now, it wasn't a huge box office success, but in my opinion, it was one of the best trailers I've ever seen for a movie, and here's why. Is on the opening trailer, he's on his dating website, right? And he is trying to court a woman from work. And he's trying to give her a wink, right? And it's not working. So what he does is he calls the customer service person over at the dating website, and he says, "Hey, I'm having difficulties getting my dating thing to work. I can't send this person I'm trying to court. I can't send her a wink. Please help me." And so the person on the phone says, "Hey, you know what? I can fix that for you, but I'm noticing your profile is kind of empty, and notice that you haven't really mentioned anything, noteworthy or mentionable." And then Ben Stiller's character says, "Well, it's I don't have anything to fill in there because I haven't done anything uh, noteworthy or mentionable." And then the person on the other line says, "Well, have you been anywhere noteworthy and mentionable?" And Ben Stiller realizes that no, he hasn't done that either. Basically, at that moment, because of what someone has portrayed to him or conveyed to him, right, which hurts, right? Um, at that moment, though, we empathize with Ben Stiller's character. We feel for him a little bit, because that thing that the person on the other line, that stranger on the other line, that revealed to him about him not doing anything noteworthy or mentionable, stings for Ben Stiller. It stings him. It hurts him, right? It hurts his pride and integrity. And the reason why it hurts his pride and integrity is because Ben Stiller realizes it's true, right? And so from that point on, we are drawn in and invested in that character and want to go with them along that journey through that movie, right? And so that worked really well for the beginning of that movie. I thought the rest of the movie, it could have been stronger, but that's for another lecture. But I thought they did a really good job in terms of setting up character empathy. Let's look at another movie, American Beauty, right? American Beauty, excuse me. Lester Burnham, right? There's a famous scene where he goes into that interview room, right? And they say that you need to write something for HR in order to help save your position at the job. Now, what this is done brilliantly, which is what makes that movie great, is that they flip it on its head. Instead of the person interviewing sort of telling him how he feels through that revealing truth that hurts him, Lester Burnham comes to the conclusion on his own. He realizes that he's just an ordinary guy with nothing to lose, right? And at that moment, even though it was done very snarky and very brilliantly, and no one really told it to them, but through the interview process, he came to that realization, and he says, "I'm just an ordinary guy with nothing to lose." At that point, we empathize with that character. We understand him and where he's coming from. Therefore, all his later actions throughout the movie, we are on the ride with. We are with him. We might not like him as a character, but we find him interesting, and at least we empathize with him and we understand where he's coming from. Let's jump to TV for a second here. So with TV, let's jump back to Breaking Bad for a minute. Okay, I like Breaking Bad a lot because I think the pilot's one of the best pilots ever written, and one of the reasons is there's a couple moments where we actually empathize with Walter, right? There's a moment where he is at the car wash, right? And he is washing the rims of this car, and then what he realizes that those rims belong to one of his students, and at that moment his student emasculates him, right? And then the reason why it stings, though, when the student basically says, you're worthless, you look at you, you're on your knees scrubbing a car, and it stings because it's true. He's nobody. He's dying of cancer, and he's got nothing to show for it, except for this shitty job where he's cleaning cars. And so that moment, that's one of the moments in the pilot, but that's one big moment where we empathize with him, right? We understand him because no one wants to be emasculated by their own students, right, while you're washing his or her car. And so that moment, again, is the moment of emasculation, the moment where the truth really hurts. I'm going to go talk about one more television example. We're going to jump to Fargo. So in the first season of Fargo, we have Lester Nygaard, right? And the opening scene with Lester, he is having a meal with his wife. And during that time, the washing machine is making a lot of noise, and the wife is asking him to fix it. And basically, he's saying how he might not be able to fix it, or he's trying. And his wife basically tells him that he is incapable or incompetent to fix the washing machine. And to do this, she compares him to his brother, right? She says that his brother recently got a promotion. He said his brother recently, got their new sound system in their new house, and that Lester is nothing like his brother. And his wife says something to him. She says, well, I guess I married the wrong Nygaard. In other words, she should have married his brother. And at that moment, you build a level of empathy for him, because as much as it hurts for a wife to say that, as much as it hurts for a wife to mention all those things to you, or to Lester in this case, the reason why it stings, the reason why it hurts Lester, the reason why we end up feeling for him, because all those things she's telling him is true. And so, again, if you can build that within your story, a moment in the beginning of your story where you are introducing your character, you want to build empathy for him or her as you're establishing the world, as you're establishing the stakes and the goals, etc. But as you're building empathy, you want that one scene, you want that one moment within your story where we build empathy for your character. And we want that one scene where a character or someone or something reveals something hurtful, something painful to that character that affects his or her integrity, pride, dignity, whatever it is. And the reason why it hurts them is because it's true, and the main character realizes that it's true. Those scenes are what makes your character not necessarily likable, just interesting, and why we want to go in the ride. So those are the three pistons that, in my opinion, is what gives your engine for your story. So just to recap, we have the stakes, but not the stakes as standalone, is the stakes in the context of your world. So again, make sure you establish your world immediately. Establish your world and how it all works, the rules and everything, as fast as you can, because that way you establish the stakes of the world much more efficiently, right? We understand why it's important to be Aquaman. We understand why it's important to be the starting quarterback, right? Because in those worlds, those things are the most important things within those worlds, and that's what's at stake. And then after that, after you establish the stakes, right? Well, how do those stakes pertain to the goals of our protagonist, right? In other words, if the protagonist doesn't reach those goals, how would that affect the stakes within our story? But as your protagonist is achieving or trying to go after the goal, make sure you know what the underlying internal goal for that character is that goes beyond just your A plot, right? It's Harry Stamper being able to go to his daughter's wedding, right? It's Jack and Rose making sure they're together. It's Andy Dufresne and Red uniting at the end. That's what's at stake. It's Jerry Maguire making sure that his business is successful with his wife Dorothy. Those are the true goals of the story, and those are truly or what's at stake, and that's what gives those pistons that oomph within your engine. And then finally, character empathy, right? Make sure that we give a hoot about your character. Make sure that we find that character interesting. Make sure that we empathize with your character. Make sure we understand him or her and where him or her is, where he or she is coming from and why he or she does what she does. If you have all three of those figured out, you are way ahead of the game in terms of giving your story that propulsion, that engine that makes the reader, the watcher, whatever you want to call it, the motivation to keep flipping, to keep watching, whatever it is. Without those, you have a boring story. You don't have anything. You have a man on a camel, but he is in the desert, but he's not hungry and he's not thirsty, right? So that's the important thing to keep in mind when thinking of your pistons for your engine. Okay, so now that I've gone through all those, what I want to switch gears on and talk about is the idea of pitching your story, right? You guys are all screenwriters, but I think one of the important things to note is how to apply all this for pitching. It's a little bit of a segue. It could be it could stand as a different lecture, but at the same time, I think as much as these pistons for your engine are pertain to a reader continuing on to reading your script or watching your movie or your TV show, it also pertains to making sure the person that's listening to your pitch is interested right from the get-go, is interested throughout the entire pitch and doesn't lose momentum, right? So long as your engine pushes that person to keep listening. And so oftentimes with screenwriters, what screenwriters are really good at doing are telling a story or explaining a story, right? That's what screenwriters do really well. And one thing that screenwriters forget, or that screenwriters often lose sight of, is that there's a difference between a good story, right, and a good story well told. Because writers are very good at telling a story, explaining a story, here's what happens. But when you're pitching your idea, when you're pitching your movie or your TV show, you have to separate the explaining from selling your show, right? There's a big difference between selling your show to somebody and explaining your show. And a lot of times screenwriters, I find, lose track of that. And to do that, I oftentimes go back to these three pistons. As much as they're important for your script, it's also important in your pitch, right? And so when you pitch somebody, when you're sitting down and you're about to sell them your story, sell them your series or your movie or whatever it is, there's basically two questions, initial questions that person has in their mind when you sit down with them. One, what the heck is your movie about, or what the heck is your TV series about? And two, where are we going with this, right? When I sit down and hear a pitch, or when executives hear a pitch, they just want to know, what's it about? Where are we going? And within all that, you explain characters, world setting, but at the end of the day, those are the two questions that they want to know. The faster you can answer those questions, in other words, the faster that your person you're pitching to can answer those questions for themselves, the easier and more effective the rest of your pitch will be. So your challenge is to make sure that those two questions are answered right away. What is this about? Where are we going with this? The faster you can get those two questions answered, in other words, if the person listening to the pitch can answer those questions in their head as they're listening to you, within 30 seconds, they're on for the ride, whether or not your pitch is 5 minutes or 10 minutes long. But if they're constantly trying to figure out what the story is about, and where we're going with this, the longer it takes for them to answer those questions, the more likely you're going to lose them. And so to do that, I want you to consider using your pistons in order to do that. So front load your story with what is the world, right? Tell me how this world works right away. And tell me what's at stake, okay? And then tell me the character, but frame it in a way where we empathize with that character. And then once we have the character empathy, what's that goal of the character? Both on the A plot, but also underlying that A plot, what are the goals of that character? If you can get those things explained immediately, right? Then your person listening to your pitch will be along for the ride right away. If you don't, then you might lose them. See, if you have those questions answered and you have those things established, you can easily go on and explain secondary characters, B plots, C plots. But if you don't have those things established, if you don't have those questions answered, then you're going to lose your audience. And so one of the litmus tests, one thing you can try doing is when you pitch your story to somebody for the first time, ask them to stop you the minute they are able to answer those two questions. So tell them that they need to be able to answer the questions for themselves. What's your story about? And where are we going with this? Okay, where is the story going? What direction are we going with it? If they can answer those two questions, tell them to stop you in the middle of your pitch the minute they can answer those questions. The challenge is to see how quickly you can get them to answer, to stop you. So if they stop you after 5 minutes, you might want to front load your pitch a little bit more so that they'll stop you perhaps even after 1 minute. The quicker they can answer those questions, the better your pitch will be, because once they know those questions, they'll be along for the ride for the remainder of that pitch. So not only should you use those pistons for your script and your screenplay, but you should also use them for your pitch as well when you are pitching your story. I spoke pretty quickly there. I breezed through a lot of stuff, finished a little early than I meant to, but that basically concludes the Story Engine webinar that I had prepared today. So I'd like to open the forum up for questions if anybody has any.
I will start off a question that I had. If you could talk a little bit more about the kind of subtext desires of a character, like the A plot, B plot of the character motivations.
Yeah.
I thought that was really, really interesting, and it's something that a lot of writers tend to forget about, that your characters need to have, like, I mean, they should want something, but there should be like an underlying want to the want. Yeah, like a need to that. To, I guess, talk a bit more about how to like structure that. What should a writer keep in mind when trying to establish the want and need? Because so many writers are like, well, they want to get the treasure, you know, and so the entire script is trying to get it, and then they get it at the end. There's no underlying anything to it.
Mm-hmm. A lot of A plots, for a lot of movies and TV shows, we call those external stakes, right? Getting the treasure, winning the medal, you know, getting home, you know, breaking out of jail, right? Those are all A plots. Those are all external goals. And a lot of times we talk a lot about internal goals as well. But I also, internal goals meaning like goals that characters want to make within themselves that they can't tangibly attain. Again, that's a different lecture, but what I like to emphasize is that every character, the external goals, the first A plot is the goal is important to many people or to multiple people within the story. So like Armageddon is a classic example. You save the world, you save millions of people, right? Let's use another example like Jerry Maguire, right? Or let's use Titanic, right? You survive the ship and a lot of people survive. But the underlying goal only pertains to your protagonist and your protagonist alone, right? Because that's what we're interested in. We're interested in our character. We're not interested in the millions of people in the world. We're not interested in the hundreds of people on the Titanic. We're not interested in how the world perceives Rod Tidwell. We're interested in our protagonist, right? And why he or she, why we like them. What is the goal, or what is the what's at stake that only pertains to protagonist and nobody else? And why is it so important to that one protagonist? And if you can tap into that, and how achieving that goal, the first goal, will mean nothing unless, fill in the blank, then that blank pertains to the character and his or her personal goals, then you'll have a strong piston for that engine. So yeah, that's how it's and by the way, it's not easy, but the best way to sort of test it out and to try it is by using that litmus statement that I say, that test statement is by saying, you know, the initial goal was to do this, but none of that matters unless, fill in the blank. And if you can do that, then you have a strong story.
Is there a role for the central conflict in the story engine?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is there a role for the central conflict in the story engine? Sure. If I understand the question correctly, you know, every story, no matter what, there has to be a conflict. Otherwise, there's no story, right? But on top of that, you have to have an engine. So in other words, like I said, I use the guy and a camel, right? Yeah, the guy and the camel is trying to get across the desert, right? Guy and the camel is trying to, ride along. But if there's no conflict, if there's nothing, you know, getting in his way, then you've got no story. So I think you can't, in my opinion, you don't have a story unless there's a conflict, unless there's something, affecting or in the way of your character. So in the sense, you don't even have, we can talk about engine, but you can't even talk about engine unless you have that initial conflict to begin with. I think that's what whoever asked that question, I think that's what the question is, unless they want to clarify.
The three elements that you were talking about, how much of those three elements could you get into a log line, and can you think of any examples?
No, I would not say. It's very difficult. A log line basically states your A plot, right? That's basically what a log line does. And what basically your characters and your A plot, and oftentimes it'll include the world as well. But at the end of the day, to be able to squeeze, your stakes, your goals, and your character empathy into a log line, I think would be pretty challenging. And so the goal of the log line is to establish who your character is and what your A plot is, and then hopefully that's enough to get your reader to read your script. But then, just like pitching your script, if you can establish your engine within the first 10 pages, then your reader will want to read more. So that's
Okay, that actually works. The next question was, should we have the engine established by page 10?
Absolutely. Did someone really ask that?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't even see that. I'm very clairvoyant today. So yes, absolutely. Because here's the thing is, people often forget or, don't remember, or just, they forget that when you're writing a screenplay in this business, if you're writing it for the sake of becoming a screenwriter, you're not writing it, unfortunately, you're not writing it for your audience that's sitting on the couch watching the TV or that's sitting in a movie theater. That's not your first audience. Your first audience is a buyer or an executive, right? And so with that in mind, you got to understand the psychology of that writer and that executive, right? And unfortunately, they have a lot of content they need to get through. And they want to know, again, just like when you're pitching with them, you want to know, what's the story about? Where are we going with this, right? And the longer you keep them waiting on that, the less likely you'll get them engaged in your story. So if you can establish the world and your characters and make you empathize with those characters and what's at stake with those goals within the first 10 pages, you will have your reader hooked. And if you don't, you have a very poor reader, in my opinion. But if you can do that, your reader will be hooked. We talked about Friday Night Lights. In the opening sequence, right off the bat, right, we understand in this town, all that matters is football. And then right off the bat, Street gets injured. Boom, right away, right? All these things happen within the first, I think, 2 minutes, right? Right off the bat, you're hooked. You know what's going on. You know what's at stake, right? In Fargo, right? The first time we meet Lester Nygaard, his wife throws all that shit on him, right? I should have married I married the wrong Nygaard. Right off the bat, we empathize with that character, right? And right off the bat, we understand, well, he ends up killing her, right? But then we understand, oh, now he's in trouble. We need to know where we're going with. We now know his goal, right? And so the sooner you establish all that, the more invested and quickly we're diving into the story. The best advice I could give emerging screenwriters is, leading up to drama is not drama. Don't backload your story with, stakes and characters there. Front load it as best you can, establish all that right away, and then build out your story from there. There are some good screenplays, there are some good stories that take a long time for it to unfold that way, but as emerging writers, it's hard for you to maintain your audience for that long. So I always advise to front load your story with all those three pistons and not worry about building the drama to the end. Because again, I'll repeat, um, building up to drama is not drama, so that's, something that I often preach. And if you can do that in your pilot where you establish those pistons within the first 10 pages, you're off to the races.
Next question is, love the insight into how to incorporate the pistons of the story engine into the verbal pitch. Would this look similar in a written pitch?
Yes. Written pitch, verbal pitch, any pitch, sign language pitch, any pitch, just, yeah, of course, 100%. Because again, your person's reading, right? If the first 2 pages or whatever page, they're not interested, they don't know what the heck's going on, they'll probably just put it aside and move on,
Okay, so you said we should get to what story is about and where we are going as well as quickly as possible when pitching. But is it okay to take the first moments to set up the world so that the stakes and goal will be far clearer?
Yeah, that is how you establish what your story is about and where we're going with this, right? You need character, you need stakes, you need all those things for the reader to understand, or for the listener to be like, okay, I see where we're going with this. I know, like here's one of the things is, let's look at the show like Walking Dead, for example, in the pilot, right? If you were to pitch that, you pitch the world immediately, zombies, don't know what's going on, here's the rules, here's how you kill them. But Rick is by himself. He's trying to survive, almost gets killed, but then he finds himself in a tank. And at the end of the pilot, as he's trying to avoid being killed by all the zombies, he hears a voice with saying, "Hey, dummy, you in the tank," right then and there, okay, I know where we're going with this, right? We're trying to survive a zombie apocalypse, and there's a group of people that are working together to do it, right? That's how I would pitch that show, right? So my point is find that moment where you know what the story is going to be about. Get to that moment quickly, but while you're doing that, make sure you establish your character and why we care about him or her. So character empathy, what the stakes, what the goals are, and what's at stake with those goals, for those goals within that world.
In the pitch, should we be hitting the high points and avoid beats?
Avoid what?
Beats.
Well, that's interesting. Define high point and define beat is what I would respond to that, because the word beat has many, many, many definitions, and I'm not sure what he or she means by high point. So if they could clarify that, I can perhaps answer that. Because again, you'd be surprised. You ask a bunch of executives, agents, and writers what the definition of a beat is, and they'll all give you different answers.
Next question is, does the logline set the world early on in a pitch, or should we hold off on the logline until after we set up the world?
That's a really tough question. It really depends. I think it's story specific, in my opinion. I think I don't recommend usually opening up your pitch with just a log line. I say you open it up with establishing the world or establishing something interesting in terms of a scene. I wouldn't normally recommend opening your pitch with a log line. And that isn't to say you can't do it or you shouldn't do it. I think for me, it's story specific. And you as a creator, you as a salesperson, have to figure out the most creative way to present your story, whether it's an opening scene, whether it's perhaps you can open with a log line, depending on what it is, or whether or not you explain the world right away. I think it's very story specific. So it's a tough question to answer. Most pitches I don't recommend opening up with a log line, but that isn't to say that you couldn't do it. There's no right or wrong way to really do a pitch. It's you as a creator have to figure out the best way to sell them on it. So I know we worked with the creator of Blind Spot on NBC, and the way that was pitched was they pitched the opening scene right away about the mysterious bag in Times Square. Bomb squad comes in, not sure what it is. The bag's open, and a naked woman covered in tattoos in the middle of Times Square pops up, and she has no idea where she is. She has no idea who she is or how she got there, and she has a bunch of tattoos on there. One of them being the name of a high-profile FBI agent who has no idea who she is or why his name is on her back. the opening scene of that show, basically when after you're done pitching that scene and the moments within the beginning of that pilot, you know where we're going with this and you know what the pilot's about. So that's one way to do it, but that's not the only way. So you know, I recommend you trying to figure out the most effective way to captivate your audience, and that's up to you to decide.
Yeah, like the show is kind of like I only watched the pilot, but that opening scene, if you guys, even if you are not interested in procedurals, that opening scene was like one of the best because it just established everything.
Yeah.
It was a scene with very minimal dialogue, and it was like a log line in action basically. So it's an excellent example. Okay, next question. Great talk, many thanks. Is it true that story engines work best over the long term, example in a series, when there is a conflict between the primary goal, the want, and the inner need? Example, Walter White, as a good family man, wants to secure his family's future, but he only succeeds in this by becoming someone very different from a good family man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, if the best stories, you know, have the strongest conflict and but not just the strongest conflict, but multiple conflicts, right? And with Walter, it's a matter of, you know, one of the tugs and pulls of the first couple seasons is he has to keep what he's doing a secret from his family. And so that alone is a conflict. Um, and so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you answered that question yourself, is that's what keeps, that's one of the engines, that's one of the pistons that keeps that series going, is that he has to keep all that a secret while he's trying to do what he does. And so the more conflict you can have, the more, I call it tugs and pulls, tug of wars that you can have within your characters, the stronger your story will be. And Walter White in Breaking Bad has a lot of tugs and pulls from many different directions. And that only makes for a stronger character, but it also makes for a stronger story.
In a pilot, how quickly should you try to introduce the goal of the series and the season? I'm assuming the pilot goal should be introduced as soon as possible, but is it important to get the season and series goals introduced sooner than later as well, or can the series goal be introduced right at the end of the pilot, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you as a writer in terms of how you want to do it. Some pilots you realize right away, you know, what the series is going to be about. Some of them you realize at the end. But just so long as you keep your pilot interesting with, you know, your stakes, with your goals, with your characters, with your beats. You know, my definition of a beat is any moment in a story where you have a subversion of expectation, where something happens where you didn't expect it to, where you know, when those beats happen, that's what propels your story. But a lot of pilots don't establish a series story until the very end. Some of them establish them at the beginning. We talk about Walking Dead. You don't establish really what the series is about until the very end, when he's in the tank and I think Glenn or somebody, you know, messages him on the intercom, says, "Yo, dummy, you in the tank." You know, from that point on, that's at the end of the pilot. We sort of get what the series is going. But Blind Spot, for example, right in the opening first two scenes or first three scenes, we immediately know where the series is going. So it's all different. The idea is to just be able to establish your story right away, establish your pistons as quickly as you can, so that you captivate your audience and propel them to keep reading. So it's up to you, but you know, whether you want to present your season, your series plot at the end or at the beginning, but you know, just there's other ways that you can keep your pilot moving in order to get to that point.
In keeping with the theme, when pitching a TV series, would you focus more on telling the story of the pilot, which would presumably be written already, versus the entire season series, considering the story engine for the pilot would be a good indication of what is to come?
Yeah, good question. I think the best way to pitch a television show is to establish the world stakes and your characters and everything right away, so that the listener has an idea of what your series is going to be about. But then after that, pitch the story of your pilot. So I'd say 99 times out of 100, I would have my clients or I have writers go in and pitch a series by introducing the characters, etc., but then right away pitching the story of the pilot. Because that essentially is what they're buying, right? For the most part, I shouldn't say all the time, but in the most part, they're buying the pilot. They're buying that idea based on what that opening show is going to look like. So I would say pitch the entire story of the pilot.
Next question. Can the goal for the protagonist change? Meaning what they think they want at the beginning isn't what they actually need. So the story would become a journey to the true goal.
Yeah, 100%. That happens all the time, you know. I mean, I don't know, like the Goonies is a perfect example. Starts off with the treasure, but they definitely find more than what they wanted, and more than just a treasure, you know. That happens all the time, and that only makes for better stories and better arcs as you know. That's how characters have arc. That's how characters change and develop, is because their goals change, and then through the difference of their goals, their characters change. Oscar Schindler in Schindler's List, right? All he cared about was making money and using Jews to do that. And by the end of the pilot, though, his goals completely changed, right? So that's what makes for great characters. So yeah, absolutely, goals change all the time.
Have you seen The Scapegoat, by the way?
Nope. What is that?
You should check it out. Everyone should check it out. It's on Netflix. I used to make my class watch it, and it's a perfect example of how a character has one need or desire, but there's a subtext desire that comes out through the movie.
Cool.
So
Okay.
for everyone that had questions on that, definitely check it out. It's on Netflix. Next question. Is every primary goal reached by the main character, or have you seen it work well where the primary goal is not reached as the underlying goal is what becomes the main driving force? Which I think is pretty much the same question as before, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of movies where the goal was never reached, you know. One of my favorite movies is 500 Days of Summer, right? He just wants to be with Summer. At the end, he definitely did not get Summer, but it left for a great ending. I'm not going to spoil it, but, there's lots and lots of movies where the character did not reach their goal. There's lots of sad movies where, characters did not reach their goal. But at the end of the day, so long as you know what that underlying goal is, and that's the thing. One thing I didn't clarify when I was explaining those examples is you don't have to succeed in that underlying goal, right? Jack and Rose did not end up together. Jack ended up dying. They don't have to succeed in an underlying goal, but so long as that underlying goal is established and takes us to the end of the movie, that's what's important. So by no means do they have to reach the goal. A lot of the best movies, they don't reach the goal. So.
But would you say, like, even if they don't reach the goal, it still has to play out in like a satisfying way?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be satisfied, not all movies have happy endings, but as long as you're satisfied, and that's, that's what makes, in my opinion, 500 Days of Summer very satisfying. It's very ambiguous at the end. I don't know I'll spoil it. If you haven't watched it by now, you don't deserve to, you don't deserve the spoiler alert. So, if basically he doesn't get Summer, but so he goes on with his life and he decides to quit his job and apply for architectural jobs, which is what he really has a passion for. And while he, is waiting in the interview lobby, he meets a girl named Autumn, right? And that's the end of the movie, right? So
yeah, and then the counter resets.
Exactly, right? So he definitely didn't reach his goal. He definitely didn't get there. But at the end of that film, I was left satisfied, and at the end of Titanic, when Jack doesn't and Rose don't end up together, as sad as it is, it's a very satisfying ending in my opinion, and so a lot of the movies, you can be satisfied without having the goal reached, or you can be satisfied with having the reaching of that goal being ambiguous, so, and this is what makes storytelling fun. This is what makes the art of storytelling challenging, is how to end a movie. And that's where you get to have fun as a writer. So
yeah, and guys, Conrad's example of 500 Days of Summer is brilliant also because when you watch that movie, what you realize is that even though his need or like his goal is, I want to be with Summer, that's not what his desire is. When he meets Autumn at the end, you learn that his actual desire is, I want to be in love. It's not about Summer. It's about his desire to be in love. It's like that girl is just filling the slot of whatever's empty. What if the setting for your stakes isn't a fixed place or location? For example, they are on a road trip. How can you tie the stakes to that setting?
Yeah, 100%. When I say world, I don't mean the actual setting itself. I mean, I mean, the world. So yeah, absolutely. It's not has nothing to do with location. It has to do, when I say world, it has to do with your surroundings, your environment, the culture, the rules and how it all takes place, or how it all works in your story. I don't know, Game of Thrones has many, many, many locations, but the rules of that world are very different from the rules of, how we do things here, well, how I do things. I can't speak for, maybe you guys, send messenger ravens, or maybe you guys have kings and queens. I don't know. But in my world, we don't have that. But the world of Game of Thrones, there's millions of locations. It has nothing to do with location. It has to do with the culture, the rules, the people that that the people live by. In the Game of Thrones, if you are blood to a king, right, and the king dies, you become the king next, right, and then therefore you now must worship that king. That's the rule of that world, right? That's not the rule of this world, or the world of Friday Night Lights, or the West Wing. So by world, I don't mean setting and location. By world, I mean environment, rules, etc.
Okay, next question. How often can goals and stakes change in a story before it becomes too shaky or difficult to follow in a story? Should this be avoided at all costs or merely approached carefully?
Approach it carefully. I think it's a story by story basis, but I mean, you don't. The simplicity is beauty, in a lot of the times when it comes to these things. I wouldn't recommend having your character change their goals on a regular basis, or changing the stakes. Just keep it simple.
I mean, talk about Game of Thrones. So
Exactly. Well, there's just a lot of characters in Game of Thrones. But that's a whole different ball game right there.
yeah, so aspire to be George R.R., but don't
Yeah,
attempt
as
it
far as
right
be
now.
there, I'd say shoot to be that. It's very challenging to set up and sell a show like Game of Thrones. There's nothing on TV like it, and that's for a reason.
Does the underlying goal need to be greater than the first goal?
Well, it depends. How do you find great? You know, so I don't know how to answer that question. It has to always come back to the stakes for that character. And so the underlying goal in that sense, if I were to answer this question, is not greater, right? The underlying goal as it pertains to the protagonist has to be greater than the initial goal, right? Because otherwise my litmus statement won't hold true, right? None of this matters. Harry Stamper saving the world doesn't matter. Jerry Maguire succeeding with Rod Tidwell doesn't matter unless fill in the blank. And the fill in the blank in this context of this question has to be greater than the initial goal. Otherwise, it doesn't matter.
So it has to be greater to the character, to the
Yeah, it has
protagonist.
to mean more to the character. Has to mean more to the protagonist to achieve the underlying goal than to achieve the initial goal. Otherwise, it doesn't matter.
I feel like I've watched too much Shark Tank because I feel compelled to talk about why I personally need to write this story. Do you think that would work during a verbal pitch?
Say that again.
I think they're talking about when you pitch, like you start with like the plot and story engine and stuff. They're saying that they want to talk about why they personally felt compelled to write the story.
Yeah,
Is
totally.
that fine to do in a pitch?
Yeah. Put it this way, absolutely. I think it's important to say why you're compelled, because one of the things that you need to convey is, why are you the one to write the story and nobody else, right? However, right, if you can, if the person listening to your pitch knows what your story is about and where you're going with this in their head already, while you tell them why you were compelled to write your story, or to tell the story, you're only going to engage them more. But if they don't know what your story is about, and if you don't know where you're going with this, and you tell them, "Oh, I'm so compelled to do this," you might lose them, right? So give them that information. Here's what my story is about. Here's where we're going with the series, or here's where we're going with this movie, right? Once they have that in their head, and you tell them, "I'm so compelled to write this because of X, Y, and Z," they're going to be that much more interested in your pitch. If you did it the other way around and said, "I'm so compelled to write this because of X, Y, and Z," and I'm sitting here being like, "I don't know what your story is about," I'm not as interested in listening to you then. So have those questions answered first, and then get into, I'm the one to tell the story. I'm the one that's really compelled to do this.
So like with a blind spot example, would it be like they would give the opening scenes and then
Yep,
be like, I felt compelled to do this because I
exactly.
found a naked woman in a duffel bag once.
Exactly. You know, that's fine. Let's use that as an example, right? Within the first three scenes, any smart executive, any executive, whether they're smart or not, will know, oh, I get it. Is the series is going to be them finding treasure pieces of a treasure map on her body, one episode at a time, and them trying to figure out who she is, what she is. Like, people immediately understand where the series is going with this. After you pitch that, the first two scenes, and you say, I'm compelled to the story because I found a treasure map on some person or something. I'm compelled to tell a story because I'm obsessed with tattoos. I'm way more interested in hearing you say that than to open with, guess what? I love tattoos. Guess what? I'm compelled to tell the story. Blah blah blah. Oh, and now let me get into my story. Like, it's just not to me. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work as effectively, in my opinion, as a pitch, because you get one chance and you only get a few minutes to grab the attention of an executive. So do the best you can with that time.
Oh, the other writer clarified. By high points, I mean both the engine and the big moments. By beat, I mean going to specific actions. This happens and then this happens. From the first question about.
Yeah, I remember the question. For me, I don't know if that really clarified me. So you're saying for high points, can you
High
expand?
points is he means both the engine and the big moments. Again, I think it's set pieces, like big moments, like I'm guessing reveals and set pieces, versus beat by beat is specific actions. Like they, in the pitch, should we be hitting the high points and avoiding and avoid the beats?
Well, okay, I see the question. No, in your pitch, when you pitch the pilot, pitch it beat by beat, saying, here's what happens in the pilot. This happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Yeah, I wouldn't just pitch high points, because again, you would lose your eyes. I want to know, what's the pilot about? Tell me what the story is. So yeah, I would not skip beats.
Could you give an example or two of movies that do a great job of making the protagonist's goal clear from the get-go?
Well, I mean, we can look at ones I talked about. We can look at Armageddon. I mean, the goal is pretty clear right off the bat what they want to try and do. What's another movie? What's another classic movie? Back to the Future is pretty clear in terms of what they want to do right off the bat. It's established. Let's see. What's another classic movie? Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Right off the bat, we understand he's just trying to play hooky and not get caught. So I would say a lot of the classic movies out there, Star Wars is pretty clear right off the bat, what the goal is. But then it's a very classic example of, while trying to achieve that initial goal, he discovers the Force and what he really needs. So I don't know. There's a lot of. I mean, I'd say just look at a lot of the classic movies out there right off the bat. You know what the initial goal is. And if you don't know what the initial goal is, it's probably going to be a very boring movie, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, guys, it's like what we always try to hammer into you, like inciting incident by page 10. Like by page 10, it needs to be established what the hell your story is about. Most movies, first 10 minutes, they'll tell you. Like, and if you don't know what the movie's about in the first 10 minutes, like Conrad said, it's probably not going to be that great a movie. Next question is, can you give examples of how season goals change over the course of a series and how that relates to the protagonist's goal?
Sure. The question is how the season arc changes throughout the series?
Examples of how season goals change over the course of a series and how that relates to the protagonist's goal.
Sure. Well, I mean, we can look at Breaking Bad, for example. Every season it's a little different, right? The first season is a matter of just getting things established as Heisenberg, and then second season is getting rid of Tuco, and getting away from Tuco, and then the introduction of Gus Fring takes us into season 3. I mean, if you look at any good TV series, every season is different. Every season has a different goal, and that's what makes interesting television. Is that, especially in drama, as the character goes through their arc, every season they have a different goal and a different agenda, and that's what makes great character arcs, so Yeah, I would say just look at any, you know, good episode, a good series of television, right? And you'll see that. So.
The Wire, very compelling, but no central protagonist for the whole series. Each
Mhm.
season had a driving story, and they all fit together as a whole, but it's hard to see there was a series goal. So do you leave room for exceptions?
Yeah, of course, 100%. I mean, The Wire is a great example. Every season, the world is different every season, right? And the main character, if there are any, you can have ensemble cast too, but The Wire is a classic example, where every season is different, the world is different every season, and the characters are different every season, Or you can look at Game of Thrones, where a lot of the main characters just die, so every season's different. Prison Break is another example where every season is one season takes place all in jail. The second season they're constantly on the run. Third season they're back in a jail, but it's in a different country. So same thing with Walking Dead. Same thing. Walking Dead is season 3, I think, takes place all in a prison, or season 4, I can't remember. All in the prison. Whereas the first season they were on the run the whole time. Seasons can change the world. The changes can change the goals, and The Wire is a little different because it's an exception to the rule because they looked at Baltimore from different levels of the politics. You have there's the government, the police, and the gangs. So obviously The Wire is an exception. But for the most part, you just want to get an idea of where we're going with this whole season and who we're trying to follow.
Do you think also, like, since each season has a different goal, how the other writer was asking how it pertains to the protagonist, could you boil it down, or would you recommend writers boil down their protagonist goal to like one thing, like Frasier you used as an example? It's he
Mm-hmm.
wants to fall in love. Like
Yeah.
every season there's like a different kind of season arc to it, like
Yeah.
especially when Niles and Daphne start their relationship. So
Mm-hmm.
Frasier's main goal is still
Yep.
love, but it's being affected differently by the season arc. So is it important to keep their boiled down to like one word, one sentence goal in
Yeah,
mind,
if you
and then
can.
how the
Yep.
season attacks it?
Yeah, if you can, but again, there's some exceptions to the rule. But at the end of the day, Walter White just wants to make enough money for his family. But as he's going through the process, his goal becomes, I want to create an empire. Don Draper's goal, in Mad Men, when at the beginning was very different at the end after he started his own firm, after his family started to fall apart, after his alter ego, the truth with Dick Whitman, I think I'm blanking on his name, start to come out, and we start to see that part of his story. So his character evolved very differently in that series, where every season the goal of this series sort of evolved. So that's the beauty of storytelling, is that there are really no really set rules, but start off simple, and then if you can evolve it differently or change it up differently after, then do it. Do what's best for the character.
I think that's a great note
Frank
to end on.
Underwood was VP for the longest time, and then he became president, and then things changed after he became president. Spoiler alert. So, so everything changes, and once you become president, your goals are different than when you were not the president.
Very true. Speaking of tattoos, our last question is, what is the molecule tattoo on your arm?
This tattoo here is the molecule for dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter in your brain that's emitted in your brain when you feel happy.
All right.
The
That's a
goal is
pretty
to
cool
the goal is
tattoo.
to be happy. The goal is to increase dopamine in your brain, and when you watch a great movie and you are satisfied at the end, when you see Andy Dufresne and Red unite on the beach at the end of Shawshank Redemption, my brain is filled with dopamine. I'm thrilled. I'm happy. I'm emotional. And
Yeah.
that's why this is a great ending to the webinar. Is at the end of the day, that's why what we do is important. I believe it's important as humans. We have emotions, and stories is one of the best ways to generate emotion within a person, within a human. And these engines, story engines, are what generates that feeling. Going back to what I said about character empathy as one of the pistons, a lot of times when you're watching a TV show, and the minute you start to feel something for a character, stop the show, press pause, and figure out, why did I just feel something for him. When I watched the trailer for Walter Mitty, even though the movie wasn't that great in my opinion, but I pressed stop and I'm like, why did I why did this trailer get me? Is because when he's sitting there and talking to the guy on the other line, and the guy's like, what, you haven't done anything noteworthy or mentionable? And he's like, not really. Right there, I pause and I'm like, why do I care? You know, why do I feel something? And I sort of took a step back and like, oh, that's why. And so these are the moments where, you know, you want to generate within your audience, right? Use those scenes in your show to generate those feelings, those emotions within your audience. And so from a macro perspective, that's what stories are supposed to do. That's why we love stories. That's why I love stories. That's why we all love stories. That's why humans love stories and go to the movies and watch TV. So